The crystal chandeliers sparkled like 1,000 tiny stars above the crowded penthouse. Expensive perfume mixed with the scent of imported champagne as the city's wealthiest people mingled and laughed. This was the kind of party where a single bottle of wine cost more than most people's monthly rent. Richard Thornton stood in the center of it all, feeling like a king in his castle. At 47 years old, he had everything money could buy. 3 homes, 2 sports cars, and more zeros in his bank account than he could spend in 3 lifetimes. He'd made his fortune buying and selling buildings across the city, and he'd made just as many enemies along the way. But tonight wasn't about business. Tonight was about showing off. He loved these charity events, not because he cared much about charity, if he was being honest with himself. He loved them because they gave him a chance to remind everyone just how successful he'd become. The boy who grew up in a tiny apartment in Queens was now hosting parties in a penthouse that cost $8 million. But there was something else Richard loved even more than showing off his wealth. He loved making people squirm. He loved watching someone's face turn red when he made a joke at their expense. His friends called it his sense of humor. His ex-wife had called it cruelty. He called it entertainment. Across the room, near the wall of windows that looked out over the glittering city, a young woman in a white catering uniform was refilling champagne glasses. Her name tag read Sophie in neat black letters. She moved quietly between the guests, practically invisible to the wealthy crowd. That's how it always was at these parties. The servers were like ghosts, seen only when someone needed a drink or an appetizer. Sophie had been working for the catering company for almost 3 years now. At 30 years old, she should have been doing something else with her life. At least that's what her mother kept telling her. But life had a funny way of changing your plans when you weren't looking. She'd had dreams once. Big dreams, the kind that made her heart race and kept her up at night with excitement. But dreams didn't pay hospital bills. Dreams didn't cover the cost of surgery or medication, or the home care nurse her father needed after his stroke. As she moved through the crowd, careful not to spill a single drop of the expensive champagne, Sophie found herself humming softly. It was an old habit she couldn't quite break, a piece by Chopin that she'd learned years ago when life was completely different, when she was a student at one of the best music schools in the country, when her biggest worry was whether she'd nail the difficult passage in the 3rd movement. She didn't notice Richard watching her from across the room. She didn't see the way his eyes narrowed when he heard her humming, or the slow smile that spread across his face. She was too busy trying to balance the tray and avoid bumping into a woman wearing a dress that probably cost more than Sophie's car. Richard had been looking for some entertainment all evening. The party was going well enough, but it felt flat somehow. These people were all the same. They talked about the same things, laughed at the same jokes, competed over who had the bigger yacht or the more exotic vacation planned. He needed something to shake things up. Something unexpected, and then he heard her humming. Classical music, if he wasn't mistaken. He didn't know much about classical music himself. He'd bought the grand piano sitting in the corner of his penthouse because his decorator said it would make the space look more sophisticated. It had cost him a small fortune to have it shipped from Germany, but he'd never actually heard it played. He didn't even know if it was in tune. An idea started forming in his mind. A wicked, perfect idea that would definitely give his guests something to talk about. He watched Sophie for another moment, waiting for the right time. She was heading back toward the kitchen, her tray empty now. Perfect. Richard picked up a silver spoon from the nearest table and tapped it against his crystal glass. The sharp, clear sound cut through the conversations, and the room gradually fell silent. 200 faces turned toward him, curious and expectant. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying easily across the large space, "I hope you're all enjoying yourselves tonight." There was a murmur of agreement, some polite applause. "I know we're here for a good cause, and I'm grateful you all came out to support it. But I think the evening needs a little something extra, don't you?" Sophie had frozen near the kitchen entrance. Something in his tone made her nervous. She'd worked enough of these events to know when trouble was brewing. "I couldn't help but notice one of our lovely servers humming earlier," Richard continued, his eyes finding Sophie in the crowd. Classical music, no less. Chopin, if I'm not mistaken. He started walking toward her, and the crowd parted like water. Now, I'm not a musical person myself, but I thought, why should we waste such talent? Why should someone who knows Chopin be stuck serving drinks when we have a beautiful piano sitting right here? completely unused. Sophie's heart started pounding. No. No. This wasn't happening. She could feel her hands starting to shake, and she set down her tray before she dropped it. "Sir, I'm really just here to work," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I don't think—" "Nonsense!" Richard's voice boomed cheerfully, but there was something sharp underneath it. Something that enjoyed watching her discomfort. He was close enough now to take her elbow, his grip firm and insistent. "My guests have paid $10,000 each for the privilege of being here tonight. I'm sure they'd love some live entertainment. Wouldn't you, everyone?" There were some uncertain chuckles from the crowd. A few people looked uncomfortable, but no one spoke up. No one ever did at these things. Sophie looked desperately toward her supervisor, a middle-aged woman standing by the kitchen door. But her supervisor just shook her head slightly, her expression apologetic but helpless. What could she do? Richard was the client. The very wealthy, very powerful client who could make sure their catering company never worked in this city again if he wanted to. Richard was already steering Sophie toward the piano, his hand on her elbow, making it clear this wasn't really a request. Her fellow servers watched with a mixture of sympathy and relief that it wasn't happening to them. The wealthy guests pulled out their phones, sensing that something interesting was about to happen. Maybe something embarrassing. Those videos always did well on social media. "This piano cost me $300,000, Richard announced to the crowd as they reached the gleaming black instrument. "Shipped all the way from Hamburg. It's supposed to be one of the finest pianos money can buy, but I've never actually heard it played. I don't have time for music myself. Too busy making money, you know." Laughter rippled through the crowd. "But surely our server here can manage something simple. Maybe Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star? That shouldn't be too difficult, right?" The laughter was louder now, more confident. People were settling in to watch the show. A blonde woman in a diamond necklace that could have paid Sophie's rent for 2 years whispered something to her companion. They both smiled, watching Sophie with the detached amusement of people watching a reality TV show. Sophie stood in front of the piano bench, her face burning with humiliation. This was exactly the kind of moment she'd spent 3 years trying to avoid. The kind of moment that reminded her of everything she'd lost, everything she'd had to give up. Her hands were trembling now, and she clasped them together to hide it. But then she looked down at the piano keys, pristine and untouched, and something unexpected happened. The fear didn't disappear, but something else rose up alongside it, something she'd been pushing down for 3 long years, something that refused to stay buried any longer. Slowly, Sophie pulled out the bench and sat down. Sophie's fingers hovered above the piano keys, not quite touching them. The room felt impossibly quiet now, despite being filled with 200 people. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She could feel Richard standing beside the piano, arms crossed, that satisfied smirk still on his face. He was enjoying this. That was the worst part. He genuinely thought this was funny, thought it was entertaining to put a working woman on the spot in front of a room full of millionaires, thought it was harmless fun to humiliate someone who couldn't fight back without losing her job. "Come on now, don't be shy," Richard said loudly, making sure everyone could hear. "Surely you can play something. Even Happy Birthday would do. That's got what, 5 notes?" More laughter from the crowd. Some people were recording now, their phones held up to capture what they assumed would be an awkward, cringe-worthy moment. Sophie wanted to run. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to stand up, apologize, and flee back to the safety of the kitchen. She could probably find another catering job. Maybe not as good as this one, but something. Anything would be better than sitting here exposed and vulnerable, while wealthy strangers waited for her to embarrass herself. But her hand stayed on the keys. Not playing yet, just resting there. And something was happening inside her chest. Something that felt like anger mixed with grief, mixed with something else she couldn't quite name. "Mr. Thornton," she said quietly, not looking at him. "You asked me to play." "That's right," he said, that edge of mockery still in his voice. "Let's hear what you've got." "And if I play something difficult? Something beyond Happy Birthday? Will you let me finish?" Richard laughed. "Sweetheart, if you can play anything more complicated than chopsticks, I'll be genuinely impressed. But sure, knock yourself out. Play whatever you want," Sophie nodded slowly. Her hands were still shaking, but not from fear anymore. She adjusted the bench, moving it slightly closer to the piano. The movement was automatic, muscle memory from years of practice. She tested the pedals with her foot. Then she placed her hands in position, fingers curved, wrists relaxed. The room was watching, waiting, expecting failure. Sophie closed her eyes and let herself remember. Not the last 3 years of serving drinks and biting her tongue and pretending she was fine. Not the hospital bills or the impossible choices or the nights she'd cried herself to sleep. She let herself remember before all of that. She remembered being 22 years old and walking onto a stage to play for a panel of judges. She remembered the weight of her dream sitting in her chest. Bright and terrifying and absolutely certain. She remembered who she used to be. Her fingers came down on the keys. The first notes exploded into the room like thunder. Not gentle, not tentative, not the uncertain plinking of someone who barely knew how to play. This was Rachmaninoff. This was powerful and passionate and technically brutal. This was years of training compressed into every movement of her hands. Richard's smile vanished instantly. His face went blank with shock. The music filled every corner of the penthouse. It was too big for the space, really. This was the kind of piece meant to be played in concert halls with perfect acoustics. But Sophie didn't care. She poured everything into it. Every humiliation of the last 3 years. Every time someone had looked through her like she was furniture. Every time she'd passed a music store and felt her heart break a little bit more. Her fingers flew across the keys with impossible speed and precision. The difficult runs that would make most pianists practice for months came as naturally as breathing. Her whole body moved with the music, leaning into the powerful sections, pulling back for the gentle moments that felt like whispered secrets. The crowd was utterly silent now. Phones were still up, but the expressions had changed completely. The smirks were gone. The woman in the diamond necklace had her hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide. A man near the windows was crying, actual tears running down his face, and he didn't even seem to notice. The music built and swelled, climbing toward a crescendo that seemed impossible to reach. Sophie's arms were starting to ache, but she didn't slow down. She pushed harder, faster, wringing every drop of emotion from the piece. This might be the last time she ever touched a piano like this. This might be the last time she let herself feel this way, so she was going to make it count. Richard stood frozen beside the piano, his face pale. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't part of the plan. He'd wanted to embarrass a waitress, to give his guests a little cruel entertainment at someone else's expense. Instead, he was witnessing something he didn't have words for. Something real and raw and beautiful in a way that made his expensive penthouse feel hollow by comparison. The other servers had abandoned their posts. They stood in doorways and against walls, watching Sophie with expressions of wonder and pride. One of them, a young man who'd worked with Sophie for 2 years, had tears in his eyes. He'd never known. None of them had known. An older man in the crowd pushed his way toward the front. He was distinguished looking, with silver hair and an expensive suit. His face showed recognition, then confusion, then something like anger. But not anger at Sophie. Anger at something else entirely. The music was reaching its climax now. Sophie's fingers hammered the keys with controlled fury, each note precise despite the speed and force. The sound was overwhelming, filling the room until it felt like the walls might crack from the pressure of it. And then with one final powerful chord, it ended. The sound hung in the air for a moment, vibrating in the silence. Then the room exploded. People were on their feet, applauding so hard their hands had to hurt. Some were shouting. The man who'd been crying was clapping with his hands above his head. The woman in diamonds was applauding with tears streaming down her carefully made-up face, not caring that her mascara was running. Sophie stood up from the bench on shaky legs. She turned to face the crowd, and for the first time in 3 years, she didn't feel invisible. She didn't feel like furniture or a ghost or something to be ignored. She felt like herself. The silver-haired man who'd pushed to the front was staring at her with intense focus. "Who are you?" he demanded, but not unkindly. His voice carried authority. That was extraordinary. "Where did you study?" Sophie's voice was quiet but steady. "Manhattan Conservatory. I was there on a full scholarship. I had to leave before graduation." Manhattan Conservatory. An older woman in the crowd gasped, pushing forward. She was dressed elegantly with kind eyes and a sharp expression. "Wait, Sophie Chen? Is that you? I remember you. You won the Steinway competition when you were 23. You were supposed to be the next great pianist. Everyone said so. What on earth are you doing serving drinks?" Sophie met her eyes. There was no shame in her expression now. Just honesty. My father had a stroke. He needed surgery, then therapy, then full-time care. The medical bills were— She paused, choosing her words carefully. They were more than I could handle and keep my scholarship. I had to choose between my dream and my father's life. It wasn't really a choice. The room had gone quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet, not the expectant, mocking quiet from before. This was the silence of people confronting something uncomfortable, something that made them think about their own choices and privileges. The silver-haired man looked like he might explode. He turned to Richard with barely concealed disgust. You have someone with this kind of talent, this kind of gift, serving champagne at your party? Do you have any idea how rare this is? How precious? Richard's face had gone from pale to red. His mouth opened and closed. But for once in his life, no clever words came out. No jokes, no cutting remarks. He just stood there looking small despite his expensive suit and $8 million penthouse. I didn't know, he finally managed to say, but the words sounded pathetic even to his own ears. No, the silver-haired man said coldly. You didn't bother to know. That's different. Sophie stood there, surrounded by people but feeling strangely alone. The applause had faded, replaced by intense conversations and people pulling out business cards. The party had transformed into something else entirely, and she wasn't sure yet if that was good or bad. The penthouse had transformed into chaos. People were rushing towards Sophie from every direction, all talking at once. Business cards appeared in front of her face like magic tricks. Voices overlapped, each one trying to speak louder than the last. You must come to my studio tomorrow, the silver-haired man was saying. He pressed a card into her hand. I'm conducting the Philharmonic next month. We need a soloist for the Tchaikovsky concerto. You'd be perfect. Wait, I want to talk to her first, a woman in a red dress interrupted. I'm a talent agent. I represent concert pianists. We need to discuss your career options immediately. Career options? A man in thick-rimmed glasses pushed forward. I run a recording studio. Classical music is making a comeback on streaming platforms. With your skill level, we could have an album out in 6 months. Sophie felt dizzy. 3 minutes ago, she'd been invisible. Now she couldn't breathe without someone trying to give her a business card or make her a promise. It was overwhelming. Too much, too fast, too loud, please, she said, her voice getting lost in the noise. Please, I need a moment, but nobody was listening. They were too excited, too caught up in their own ideas about what she should do next. The woman who'd recognized her was telling someone about the Steinway competition. A man was on his phone, already trying to book a venue for a comeback concert. Another person was talking about grants and funding and opportunities. Through the crowd, Sophie caught a glimpse of her supervisor still standing by the kitchen entrance. The woman looked terrified, probably calculating how much trouble she was going to be in for letting her server abandon her post. The other catering staff were watching with mixed expressions. Some looked happy for her. Others looked worried, maybe thinking about what this meant for the rest of their shift. And then there was Richard. He'd moved away from the piano, backing up slowly until he reached the wall of windows. He stood there now alone, watching the chaos unfold around Sophie. His face was hard to read. The smugness was completely gone, replaced by something that looked almost like confusion, like he'd just realized he'd broken something he hadn't meant to break, or maybe unleashed something he couldn't control. Sophie managed to extract herself from the crowd for a moment, mumbling something about needing air. She slipped through a doorway that led to a small balcony. The cool night air hit her face and she took a deep, shaky breath. The city stretched out below her, millions of lights twinkling in the darkness. Somewhere down there was her tiny apartment. Her father was probably asleep by now, the night nurse watching TV in the living room. He had no idea what had just happened. No idea that his daughter had just played piano in front of 200 wealthy people. No idea that her carefully constructed wall of denial had just come crashing down. She heard the door open behind her. She didn't turn around, but she knew who it was. She could feel his presence even before he spoke. That was quite a performance, the silver-haired man said. His voice was gentler now without the audience to play to. I meant what I said about the Philharmonic. I'm Leonard Hastings. I've been conducting for 30 years and I've heard a lot of pianists. What you did in there, that was special. Sophie nodded but didn't speak. She was afraid if she started talking she might start crying, and she'd cried enough over the past 3 years. The woman who recognized you, Leonard continued, coming to stand beside her at the railing. Patricia Morgan. She's on the board at Manhattan Conservatory. She also runs a foundation that helps artists in financial crisis. She's helped dozens of musicians get back on their feet after setbacks. That's nice, Sophie said quietly. You don't sound excited. I don't know what I am, Sophie admitted. 3 years ago, losing music felt like losing a limb. Like part of me had been cut away and I'd have to learn how to live without it. And I did learn. I figured out how to get through each day without thinking about it constantly. Without wanting it so badly it hurt. And now I don't know if I can go back. What if I try and fail? What if I've lost too much time? What if I'm not as good as I used to be? She finally turned to look at him. What if tonight was just muscle memory and there's nothing else left? Leonard smiled, but it was a sad smile, understanding. You know what I heard in there? I heard someone who hasn't touched a piano in 3 years play Rachmaninoff like she learned it yesterday. I heard technique that most pianists practice their whole lives to achieve. But more than that, I heard feeling. I heard pain and joy and anger and hope all mixed together. You can't fake that. You can't manufacture that kind of emotion. Sophie looked down at her hands. Her fingers were red from the force of playing. There was a small blister forming on her right thumb. She hadn't noticed it while she was playing, but now it stung. My father doesn't know I still miss it, she said softly. He thinks I'm fine. He thinks I moved on. He already feels guilty enough about what his illness cost me. If he knew how much it hurt to give up music, it would destroy him. Maybe, Leonard said. Or maybe he'd want you to have a second chance. Maybe he'd be proud that you sacrificed for him and relieved that you might get your dream back. Before Sophie could respond, the door opened again. This time it was Richard. He hesitated when he saw Leonard, clearly uncomfortable, but he stepped out onto the balcony anyway. Sorry to interrupt, he said stiffly. I just wanted to... He stopped, seeming unsure how to continue. This was clearly unfamiliar territory for him. Apologizing wasn't something he did often. Maybe not something he'd ever really done sincerely. Leonard gave Sophie's shoulder a gentle squeeze. Think about what I said. Call me tomorrow if you want to talk more. He handed her his card again, making sure she actually took it this time. Then he nodded at Richard and went back inside, leaving them alone. The silence stretched out between them. Richard looked out at the city, not meeting her eyes. His hands were shoved deep in his pockets. I'm not good at this, he finally said. At what? At admitting I was wrong. He laughed, but it was a bitter sound. I wanted to embarrass you. I thought it would be funny. I thought you were just a waitress and I could use you for entertainment, and everyone would have a good story to tell at their next party. He paused. I'm not proud of that. I'm not proud of a lot of things I do. Sophie waited. She wasn't going to make this easier for him. I've spent my whole life collecting things, Richard continued. Expensive things. Impressive things. Things that make other people jealous. That piano in there. I bought it because my decorator said it would make the room look better. I never even had it tuned. Never asked if anyone could play it. It was just another object to own. And, Sophie prompted, and tonight I realized something. He finally turned to look at her. I've been treating people the same way I treat my possessions. Like they're just objects in my world. Like they exist to make me look good or feel important or provide entertainment. I never thought about... He stopped, struggling with the words. I never thought about what it cost them. Sophie studied his face. He looked older suddenly. Tired. The confidence and swagger had drained away, leaving someone who seemed almost lost. I'm sorry, Richard said, for what I did. For what I've probably done to dozens of other people without even noticing. I'm sorry. It wasn't the most eloquent apology. It wasn't pretty or polished, but it sounded real. Maybe the first real thing he'd said all night. Sophie nodded slowly. I'm not going to tell you it's okay because it wasn't. What you did was cruel. You tried to humiliate me in front of all those people. I know. But here's the thing. Sophie looked back at the city lights, gathering her thoughts. I've been hiding for 3 years, pretending I didn't miss music, pretending I was fine with how my life turned out, pretending that dreams don't matter as much as bills and responsibilities. She turned back to him. You forced me to stop pretending. You forced me to remember who I used to be. And yes, your reasons were terrible. But the result... She paused, feeling the truth of it settle in her chest. The result might have saved me. Richard looked stunned. I don't understand. Neither do I completely, Sophie admitted. But I think sometimes we get so comfortable being miserable that we forget we have a choice. We forget we can fight back. You meant to break me, but instead you reminded me I'm not broken. Just bent, and bent things can straighten out again. Back inside, the party was winding down, but people were still talking about what they'd witnessed. The video recordings were probably already being shared, already spreading across social media. By morning, thousands of people would have seen Sophie play, would have heard her story. She wasn't invisible anymore. For better or worse, everything had changed. Sophie woke up the next morning to 73 missed calls and over 200 text messages. Her phone had been buzzing nonstop since 6 in the morning. She sat up in bed, her small apartment bedroom feeling even smaller than usual, and scrolled through the notifications with growing disbelief. The videos had gone viral. Completely, absolutely viral. Waitress stuns millionaire's party with incredible piano performance. Hidden talent revealed after cruel joke backfires. You won't believe what happened when this billionaire tried to embarrass a server. The headlines kept coming, each one more dramatic than the last. The main video had already been viewed 8 million times. 8 million. Sophie's hands trembled as she watched herself play on the small phone screen. It looked different from this angle, shot by someone in the crowd. You could see her face, the intensity of her concentration. You could see Richard's expression change from smug to shocked. You could see the moment everything shifted. The comment section was overwhelming. Thousands of people sharing their own stories of being underestimated, of having hidden talents, of giving up dreams for family. Some were angry at Richard. Others were inspired by Sophie. Many were asking where they could hear her play again. Her father's voice called from the living room. "Sophie, are you awake? Your phone has been ringing all morning." She got out of bed, pulling on a sweater, and walked into the living room. Her father sat in his wheelchair by the window, where he liked to watch the street below. The morning nurse had already left. Her father looked concerned but curious. "Dad, something happened last night at work," Sophie began, not sure how to explain any of this. "I know," he said quietly. "Mrs. Chen from downstairs came up an hour ago. She showed me the video on her phone. She said the whole neighborhood is talking about it." He wheeled himself closer to her. "Sophie, why didn't you tell me you still played?" "I don't," Sophie said, then corrected herself. "I didn't. I haven't touched a piano in 3 years. Until last night." "Until last night," she agreed. Her father was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. "You gave it up for me. The conservatory. Your scholarship. Your whole future. Dad, don't let me finish." His voice was firm but gentle. "I've spent 3 years watching you pretend to be happy. Watching you work double shifts and come home exhausted. Watching you avoid music stores and change the channel whenever classical music came on TV. I thought maybe you'd moved on. Maybe you'd found peace with it." He paused, his eyes glistening. "But you didn't move on, did you? You just buried it." Sophie felt tears starting to form. "You needed help. The surgery, the therapy, the medical bills. What was I supposed to do?" "I don't know," her father said honestly. "But I know what I don't want. I don't want you to spend the rest of your life serving drinks and pretending you're fine. I don't want my illness to be the reason you gave up on your dreams." He reached for her hand. "I'm your father. I'm supposed to help you build your future, not destroy it." "You didn't destroy anything," Sophie insisted. "Maybe not destroy, but I let you sacrifice too much. And I think," he squeezed her hand, "I think if you have a chance to get some of it back, you should take it." Sophie's phone buzzed again. She glanced at it. Leonard Hastings had sent another message, his third that morning. "Please call me. I'm serious about the Philharmonic. We need to talk." There were other messages too. Patricia Morgan, the woman from the conservatory board, had left a voicemail about her foundation. The talent agent wanted to meet for coffee. A reporter from a major newspaper wanted an interview. 3 different venues had reached out about booking a solo concert. It was too much. It felt like standing at the edge of a cliff being asked to jump without knowing if she could still fly. Her phone rang again. This time it was a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer, but something made her press the accept button. "Hello? Ms. Chen? This is Patricia Morgan. We met last night at Richard Thornton's party. I hope it's not too early to call." "No, it's fine," Sophie said, wandering back toward her bedroom for privacy. "I've been thinking about you all night," Patricia said. Her voice was warm, professional, but also excited. "I did some research. I found your old competition recordings. Sophie, you were extraordinary even back then. And last night? Last night was something else entirely. Thank you, Sophie said, not sure what else to say. I want to be direct with you because I think you've had enough people dancing around the truth. Your father's medical situation put you in an impossible position. You made the choice any good daughter would make. But that doesn't mean it was fair. That doesn't mean you should have had to choose. Sophie felt her throat tighten. My foundation exists specifically for situations like yours, Patricia continued. We provide financial support and career assistance to artists who've had to step away from their work due to circumstances beyond their control. Medical crises, family emergencies, things like that. We help them find their way back. I don't know if I can find my way back, Sophie admitted. It's been 3 years. 3 years without practice, without lessons, without... You played Rachmaninoff last night like you'd been practicing it yesterday, Patricia interrupted gently. Yes, you'll need time to rebuild your stamina. Yes, you'll need coaching to get back to competition level. But the foundation? The talent? That's still there. That doesn't just disappear. Sophie sat down on her bed, feeling overwhelmed again. What exactly are you offering? Full financial support for you to return to training. We'll cover lessons with any teacher you choose. We'll help with your father's ongoing care costs so you don't have to work double shifts anymore. We'll connect you with venues and opportunities. Basically, we'll try to give you back what you lost. Not the time, we can't do that. But the chance? Yes, we can give you that. It sounded too good to be true. Sophie had learned that things that sounded too good to be true usually were. Why? She asked. Why would you do all this for me? Patricia laughed softly. Because I've been where you are. Different circumstances, but same impossible choice. I was a violinist many years ago. Very promising career ahead of me. Then my mother got sick. I gave it all up to take care of her. By the time she passed away, I was too old to restart my career. Too much time had passed, she paused. I started this foundation so that other artists wouldn't have to make the same sacrifice I did. So they wouldn't have to choose between loving their family and loving their art. Sophie felt tears running down her face now. She didn't try to stop them. I'm scared, she whispered. What if I try and fail? What if I'm not good enough anymore? Then you fail, Patricia said simply. And you pick yourself up and try again. Or you discover that maybe your path leads somewhere different than you expected. But at least you'll know. At least you'll have tried. The worst thing isn't failure, Sophie. The worst thing is spending your whole life wondering what if. After they hung up, Sophie sat on her bed for a long time, holding her phone. Through her thin apartment walls, she could hear the neighbor's TV, someone's music playing, the normal sounds of life continuing around her. Her fingers still ached from last night. The blister on her thumb was definitely there now, red and tender. She pressed it gently, feeling the sting. It had been years since she'd had a blister from playing. She'd forgotten how much they hurt, how much they meant. Her phone buzzed one more time. Another message, but this one was different. It was from Richard. I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, but I wanted you to know something. I've decided to donate the piano to Manhattan Conservatory in your name. They'll put it in one of the practice rooms where students who can't afford their own instruments can use it. Seemed like a better use than sitting in my penthouse collecting dust. Also, Patricia Morgan mentioned her foundation might need additional funding. I'd like to help with that if she'll let me. Not looking for forgiveness or praise, just trying to do something right for once. Sophie read the message 3 times. Then she stood up and walked back to the living room where her father was still sitting by the window. Dad, she said, I think I need to make a phone call. He turned to look at her and she saw hope in his eyes. Real hope, not the fake kind they'd both been carrying for 3 years. To Leonard Hastings? He asked. She nodded. To Leonard Hastings. And to Patricia. And maybe to a few other people. She took a deep breath. I think I'm going to try. Her father smiled, and it was the first genuine smile she'd seen from him in a long time. Good, that's my girl. That's my Sophie. She picked up her phone, found Leonard's number, and pressed call before she could change her mind. Her heart was racing, her palms were sweating, but her finger didn't shake. Maybe, just maybe, she could still fly after all. 3 months later, Sophie stood backstage at Carnegie Hall, her hands shaking for an entirely different reason than they had at Richard's party. This was the good kind of nervousness, the kind that meant something important was about to happen, the kind that reminded her she was alive. Through the heavy curtain, she could hear the audience settling into their seats. The murmur of hundreds of conversations, the rustling of programs, the occasional cough. Carnegie Hall, she was actually here, about to walk onto one of the most famous stages in the world. The past 3 months had been a blur. Patricia's foundation had been true to every promise. Sophie had been working with one of the best piano teachers in the city, rebuilding her technique, strengthening her hands, relearning pieces she thought she'd forgotten. It turned out her fingers remembered more than she'd realized. The muscle memory was still there, buried but not dead. Her father's care had been handled too. A better nurse, better therapy, better equipment. He was doing well, better than he'd been in years. And he'd be in the audience tonight, front row, where she could see him if she needed the encouragement. Leonard appeared beside her, dressed in his conductor's formal wear. "You ready?" he asked quietly. "I don't know," Sophie admitted. "Ask me again in 5 minutes," he smiled. "I've seen you practice every day for the last month. You know this piece backwards and forwards. You could play it in your sleep, that's what I'm afraid of. What if I'm just going through the motions? What if there's no feeling anymore?" Leonard put a hand on her shoulder. "Sophie, you've been through something most musicians never experience. You lost your dream, mourned it, and found it again. That's not something you can fake. When you play tonight, all of that will be in the music. Just trust yourself." A stage manager appeared, headset on, clipboard in hand. 5 minutes, Ms. Chen, 5 minutes. Sophie closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She thought about the last 3 years. The double shifts, the exhaustion, the carefully maintained pretense that she was fine. She thought about her father in his wheelchair, watching her give up everything for him. She thought about Richard's cruel smile the moment before she sat down at that piano, and she thought about the music, about how it had saved her even as she was losing it, about how it had been waiting for her all this time, patient and faithful, ready to welcome her back. 2 minutes, the stage manager said. Sophie opened her eyes. Her hands had stopped shaking. She felt calm now, centered, ready. The curtain parted slightly and she walked out onto the stage. The applause was immediate and thunderous. The hall was packed, every seat filled. She saw her father in the front row, tears already streaming down his face, clapping so hard she worried about his heart. Next to him sat Patricia, elegant and proud. Leonard's wife was there and several of Sophie's old professors from the conservatory who'd reached out after seeing the video. And in the back row, almost hidden in the shadows, sat Richard. He was dressed simply, not in his usual flashy style. When their eyes met, he nodded once. Just a small acknowledgement. She nodded back. Sophie sat at the piano, adjusted the bench, and placed her hands on the keys. The audience fell silent. This was it. This was the moment everything had been leading to for 3 years. Maybe for her whole life. She began to play. The piece was Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, but not the gentle first movement everyone knew. She was playing the third movement, the one that was fierce and fast and technically brutal, the one that demanded everything from the pianist. Her fingers flew across the keys with the precision of someone who'd spent 3 months doing nothing but preparing for this moment. But it wasn't just technique. It wasn't just notes played correctly in the right order. It was feeling. It was every ounce of pain and hope and fear and joy she'd experienced since that night at Richard's party. The music built and swelled, filling the massive hall with sound. Sophie lost herself in it completely. She wasn't thinking about the audience or the critics or the recordings that would be made of this performance. She was just playing, just feeling, just being herself in the most complete way possible. She thought about the waitress uniform she'd worn for 3 years, about the weight of serving trays and the ache in her feet at the end of long shifts, about the carefully neutral expression she'd learned to wear, the one that said "I'm fine" when she wasn't fine at all. But she also thought about her father's smile this morning when she'd helped him get dressed, about Patricia's phone call offering her a chance she'd thought was gone forever, about Leonard's patient teaching and his belief that she could do this, about the other servers from that night who'd sent her messages of support and congratulations, even about Richard in his own strange way, about how sometimes the worst moments in our lives crack us open just enough to let the light back in. The music reached its climax, her hands moving so fast they were almost a blur. The power of it, the intensity, made several people in the audience gasp. This wasn't pretty music. This was raw, honest, real. This was everything she'd been holding inside for 3 years, finally set free. And then, with one final decisive chord, It was over. The silence lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then the audience exploded. People were on their feet before Sophie had even lifted her hands from the keys. The applause was deafening, echoing off the walls of the historic hall. Her father was crying openly now, not even trying to hide it. Patricia was clapping with her hands above her head. Even the ushers along the walls were applauding. Sophie stood and turned to face the audience. She bowed, feeling tears on her own cheeks now. But they were good tears. Happy tears. The kind that meant healing. The applause continued. She bowed again. And again. People were calling out, "Brava!" Some were whistling. The ovation went on for so long that Sophie lost track of time. She just stood there, letting it wash over her, letting herself finally believe that this was real. Eventually, the applause began to fade. The audience settled back into their seats, waiting to see if there would be an encore. Sophie hadn't planned one, but suddenly she knew exactly what she wanted to play. She sat back down at the piano without announcing anything. She placed her hands on the keys and began to play Chopin, the same piece she'd been humming that night at Richard's party. The one that had started everything, but this time she played it differently. Not with anger or pain, but with gratitude. Gratitude for the journey, even the hard parts. Gratitude for the people who'd helped her find her way back. Gratitude for the music itself, which had never really left her. When she finished, the audience was quieter this time. The applause was warm but more subdued, as if people understood this had been something personal. Something sacred. Sophie stood and bowed one final time. Then she walked off the stage, back through the curtain into the wings where real life was waiting. Leonard was there, beaming. That was perfect. Absolutely perfect. Patricia appeared with her father in his wheelchair. He reached up and took Sophie's hand, squeezing it tight. "I'm so proud of you," he whispered. "Your mother would be too." Sophie knelt down and hugged him, not caring that she was wrinkling her concert dress. "Thank you for letting me try again. Thank you for being brave enough to do it," he said. Later, at the small reception, people crowded around Sophie with congratulations and business cards and offers. But she noticed Richard standing alone by the window, looking out at the New York skyline. She excused herself and walked over to him. "Thank you for coming," she said. He turned, looking uncomfortable. "I wasn't sure if I should, but I wanted to see how the story ended." "This isn't the ending," Sophie said. "This is just the beginning." Richard nodded slowly. "I've been thinking a lot about that night. About who I was. Who I still am, probably." He paused. "I've started volunteering at a music school in the Bronx, teaching kids about, well, not about music. I don't know anything about music, but about how to treat people. How not to treat people, really." Sophie smiled. "That's good. That's really good." "I'm trying," Richard said simply. "Trying to be better than I was. I don't know if I'll ever get there, but I'm trying." "That's all any of us can do," Sophie said. She looked around the room at all the people who'd helped her get here. Her father, Patricia, Leonard, her old professors, new friends she'd made in the last 3 months. Even Richard in his own complicated way. 3 months ago she'd been invisible. A waitress serving drinks to people who didn't see her. Now she was here, having just played Carnegie Hall, with opportunities spreading out before her like an open road. But the most important thing wasn't the success or the recognition or even the music itself. It was simpler than that. She'd remembered who she was. She'd found the courage to reach for her dream again, even after losing it. She'd learned that sometimes our worst moments can lead to our best ones if we're willing to keep going. Sophie Chen, who'd once served champagne at a Millionaire's party, had finally come home to herself. And that, more than any standing ovation or sold-out concert, was the real victory. The music had been waiting, and now finally she was ready to play.